The dog was not crawling toward safety. He was crawling toward the car he would not let anyone touch. Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Walker heard the first scratch just after midnight, when rain slid down the windows of his small garage outside Colorado Springs and the mountains had disappeared behind a cold black sky. He had been working late on a faded gray sedan, one of those older family cars with stubborn wiring and a back door that would not unlock unless it felt like forgiving someone. The car belonged to Megan Riley, a young military wife who had dropped it off that morning after it died near the grocery store. Ethan had promised to look at it before the weekend. He was washing grease from his hands when the scratch came again. Not at the front door, not at the fence, at the garage side entrance. Slow, weak, dragging across the wood like something asking permission to be believed. Ethan turned off the faucet. The garage settled around him with the smell of motor oil, rain, metal tools, old coffee, and wet concrete. Then came a low whine, thin enough to be mistaken for wind if a man had learned to ignore things. Ethan had not. Not anymore. He opened the side door, and the storm breathed in. On the step lay a German shepherd, black and tan with sable along his back, soaked to the skin, amber eyes open but fading with exhaustion. Mud covered his paws. A torn collar hung loose at his neck. On that collar, caught beneath the buckle, was a small pink ribbon, darkened by rain. The dog tried to stand and failed. Ethan dropped to one knee. "Easy, boy," he said, keeping his hands slow. "You found the right door." But the German shepherd did not crawl toward the blanket near the heater. He did not crawl toward the water bowl Ethan kept for neighborhood dogs. He pulled himself across the garage floor, inch by inch, leaving wet marks on the concrete, and went straight to the gray sedan. Ethan followed, heart tightening with every sound the dog made. The German shepherd reached the rear passenger door, placed his body against it, and lowered his head over the handle as if guarding it with the last strength he had left. Ethan reached for the door. The dog lifted his muzzle and gave one low warning sound. Not fierce, not threatening. A boundary, a plea. Ethan froze. Rain beat the garage roof. The old fluorescent light buzzed above them. The sedan sat silent, windows fogged at the edges, child's seat in the back, a faint vanilla car freshener swinging from the mirror. Ethan looked from the dog to the car and noticed what he had missed before. Tiny claw marks near the rear door seam, a muddy smear on the glass, and the strap of a child's backpack caught between the seat and the back panel. The German shepherd pressed his nose to the door and whined again, softer now, breaking with exhaustion. Ethan felt the old memory rise before he could stop it. A car left after a winter storm years ago. Everyone saying it was empty, everyone moving on too soon. He had believed them then. He did not believe silence now. Slowly, Ethan set his hand flat on the roof of the sedan and bent close to the rear window. "Is somebody in there?" he called, his voice steady though his chest was not. The dog stopped breathing for one long second. Then, from somewhere inside the car, came a sound so small it barely touched the rain. Tap. One weak tap against plastic. Ethan looked down at the German shepherd, at the pink ribbon on his collar, at the body that had dragged itself through a storm to keep one door from being ignored. He reached for his phone. "Hold on," he whispered to whoever was hidden inside. "He brought me to you." Ethan did not open the sedan. Not yet. Every instinct in him wanted to pull the rear door wide and reach for the sound inside. But years of discipline held his hands still. A door could save someone, or it could hurt them if opened the wrong way at the wrong moment. He kept one palm on the wet roof, lowered his head near the glass, and listened again. Rain struck the garage shingles. Water ran beneath the side door in thin silver lines. The old fluorescent light above the workbench hummed like a tired insect. Beneath all of it, from somewhere behind the rear seat, came another faint tap. The German shepherd lifted his head at the sound and pushed his nose harder against the door seam, his whole body shaking from cold and willpower. "I hear it," Ethan said softly. "I hear you." He called Officer Karen Mitchell first. His voice stayed level because panic did not make locks kinder. "Karen, it is Ethan Walker. I need you at my garage. Possible child trapped in a vehicle. Electrical lock failure. Dog brought me to it." The silence on the other end lasted less than a second. "I am on my way. Do not force the door unless there is immediate danger." "Understood." Ethan ended the call and grabbed 2 clean towels from the shelf by the heater. He laid one over the dog's back without pulling him away from the sedan. The German shepherd flinched once, then accepted the warmth, but his eyes never left the rear door. Ethan set the second towel near his paws and looked closely at the collar. The pink ribbon was tied clumsily but lovingly, its end torn and dark with rain. Beneath it, a metal tag caught the light. Shadow. Ethan read the name out loud. The dog's ears shifted. Shadow. Ethan said again, gentler this time. You did good. Stay with me. Shadow answered with a breath that was almost a whine. Ethan tried Megan Riley's number twice. No answer. He left one message, calm but urgent, then called Mrs. June Parker next door, because June knew every family on the street and every car that came through his garage. She answered on the third ring, voice thick with sleep. Ethan. June, the Riley sedan is here. Do you know if Megan has a daughter? Sophie, June said at once. 7 years old. Little pink backpack. Shadow follows her everywhere. Ethan looked at the strap caught behind the rear seat. Did you see them today? Megan came by this morning after the tow truck. Sophie was not with her then, I do not think. What? Ethan did not answer right away. Shadow pressed one paw against the rear door panel and scratched once, weakly. From inside came a tiny tap in reply. June heard Ethan stop breathing. Ethan. He turned toward the car window. Sophie. He called, loud enough to carry but not to frighten. My name is Ethan Walker. Shadow is here with me. If you can hear me, tap once. The garage seemed to fold itself around that question. Shadow went still. The rain went on. Then, from inside the gray sedan, one small tap answered. Ethan closed his eyes for half a heartbeat, then opened them and moved with care. He switched on the portable work light and aimed it through the rear window. The beam caught the child's seat, the fogged glass, the back seat, the shadowed gap where the folding seat met the cargo space. Something pale moved there. Not much. Enough. Officer Mitchell's headlights swept across the driveway. Ethan opened the garage door halfway, letting in cold air, red-blue reflections, and the smell of rain on asphalt. Shadow tried to rise when he saw the officer, but his legs failed him. Ethan steadied him with one hand. No one is taking you away from the car, he said. Officer Mitchell stepped inside, calm, gloved, already seeing the dog, the ribbon, the claw marks, the backpack strap, the fogged glass. Sophie. She called through the window, kneeling by the door. We are going to open this safely. Stay still if you can. From inside came another faint tap, weaker than before. Shadow lowered his head against the door handle, as if lending her the last of his strength through the metal. Ethan looked at Officer Mitchell. This dog knew before any of us did. The officer nodded once. Then we listened to him. Officer Mitchell did not try the handle first. She stood beside the sedan and studied the whole car the way a careful person studies a sleeping child, with respect for what might happen if the wrong thing moved. The gray sedan sat under the garage lights with rainwater sliding down its windows, the vanilla air freshener swinging faintly from the mirror, the rear glass fogged from the inside. Shadow lay pressed against the passenger's side, towel over his back, amber eyes locked on the seam where the door met the frame. His body was failing him, but his focus was not. Ethan pulled the portable work light closer and angled it through the rear window. The beam cut across the child's seat, the floor mat, the caught backpack strap, then reached the narrow opening where the rear seat folded into the cargo space. Something shifted there. A small hand, pale in the light, moved once and disappeared. Officer Mitchell spoke through the glass, calm and clear. Sophie, this is Officer Mitchell. Ethan and Shadow are right here. We are going to get you out safely. From inside came one weak tap. Shadow answered with a low whine that seemed to rise from the concrete itself. Ethan crouched beside the dog and kept one hand on his shoulder. Easy, he whispered. She heard you. Mrs. June Parker appeared in the open garage doorway wearing a raincoat over her nightgown and holding a flashlight she did not need. Her face changed when she saw the backpack strap. That is Sophie's, she said. Pink with little stars. She takes it everywhere. Officer Mitchell looked at Ethan. How did the car get here? Tow truck dropped it off at 9 this morning, Ethan said. Megan said the battery kept draining and the rear lock was acting strange. I had not opened the back yet. June pressed one hand to her chest. Megan thought Sophie was at after-school art club. The school must have thought Megan picked her up early. The words hung in the garage like another kind of rain. Not cruelty, not neglect, just ordinary confusion, a chain of assumptions strong enough to hide a child in plain sight. Shadow lifted his head at Sophie's name and scratched once at the lower panel, so weak his nails barely touched the paint. Ethan heard the answer from inside, soft but real. Tap. Officer Mitchell called for paramedics and a vehicle lock technician, then checked the windows again. "We do this clean," she said. "No sudden moves unless her breathing changes." Ethan nodded and moved to the workbench for a slim inspection camera he used for engines. He fed the small lens carefully through the gap where the rear seat strap had caught. The screen flickered, then steadied. In the blue-gray light, Sophie Riley was curled in the cargo pass-through space behind the back seat, wrapped partly in her pink jacket, cheeks pale, eyes open. Her backpack was wedged near her knees. The faulty lock had trapped the rear door, and the seat had folded back just enough to hold her in a narrow, awkward space. She was frightened, tired, but awake. Ethan swallowed hard and kept his voice steady. "Sophie, I can see you. Do not try to move. Shadow is here." Her lips moved. The camera microphone barely caught it. He came back. Ethan looked down at the German Shepherd. Mud, rain, ribbon, torn paws. All of it had carried that answer to this garage. "Yes," Ethan said. He came back. Shadow closed his eyes for one breath, then opened them again, refusing rest until the door gave way. Outside, paramedic lights washed softly across the driveway. Officer Mitchell set her gloved hand near the lock panel. Ethan reached for the manual release tool. June stepped back and began to pray under her breath. The whole garage went quiet around the tiny screen showing Sophie's face. Ethan had spent years fixing engines that would not start and wires that refused to speak. But this was different. This time, the broken thing was not just a car. It was a silence. And a wounded dog had dragged himself through the rain to make sure somebody finally heard what was trapped inside it. Officer Mitchell waited until the paramedics were at the garage door before she touched the release tool. Rain still hammered the roof, but inside Ethan's garage the world had narrowed to the gray sedan, the tiny screen on the workbench, and the German Shepherd refusing to let his tired body give up. Sophie's face remained visible through the inspection camera, pale in the blue light, her eyes open just enough to follow Ethan's voice. "You are doing great, Sophie," he said, steady as a handrail. "We are going to open the door slowly. Shadow is right here." At the sound of his name, Shadow lifted his head from the concrete. The towel slipped from his shoulders, but he did not care. His amber eyes stayed on the rear door, and the pink ribbon on his collar trembled each time he breathed. Officer Mitchell looked once at Ethan. "Ready?" Ethan nodded and braced one hand against the seat frame through the front opening, careful not to move anything near Sophie too quickly. The manual release resisted at first. The faulty lock clicked, then held, then clicked again with a dry metallic sound that made everyone in the garage stop breathing. Shadow gave one low whine, not loud, but sharp enough to make Ethan's chest tighten. "Easy," Ethan whispered. "Almost." Officer Mitchell adjusted the tool and tried again. This time the rear door loosened by half an inch. Cold air moved out, carrying the smell of vanilla, damp fabric, old upholstery, and fear that had sat too long in a closed place. "Sophie," Officer Mitchell said softly, "do not reach toward the door. Let us come to you." A small voice answered from behind the seat. "Is Shadow there?" Ethan looked down. Shadow had dragged himself upright somehow, front paws shaking, nose pressed to the gap. "He is here," Ethan said. "He never left the car." The door opened wider, inch by inch. The paramedic leaned in first, speaking gently, checking space, asking Sophie to blink if she could hear. Ethan folded the rear seat forward with slow care, and the cargo pass-through opened enough for the work light to spill across the pink backpack, the jacket, the small tennis shoes tucked awkwardly beneath the blanket Sophie had pulled from the back. She was cold. She was scared, but she was awake. When the paramedic lifted her carefully from the narrow space, Sophie reached one hand not toward the adults, not toward the lights, but toward Shadow. Ethan guided the dog closer without letting him stumble. Shadow touched his nose to her fingers and went still, as if the whole storm had finally found its ending in that one touch. Sophie tried to smile. "I told him to get help," she whispered. Mrs. June Parker cried openly then, one hand pressed to the garage wall. Officer Mitchell turned away for a breath and spoke into her radio, confirming the child was out and alert. Ethan stood beside the open car door, his hands still on the frame, and looked at the place where silence had almost won. He saw the child's seat, the faulty lock, the backpack strap caught like a small flag, the pink ribbon on Shadow's collar, and the muddy claw marks near the door seam. The story was beginning to explain itself without needing blame. Sophie had climbed into the back to get her backpack after the tow truck left the car inside the garage. The electrical lock had failed. The folding seat had shifted. Her voice had been swallowed by rain, metal, and midnight. But Shadow had heard. He had heard what walls and weather had hidden. He had scratched, run, returned, and crawled through the storm until Ethan opened the right door. The paramedics wrapped Sophie in a warm blanket and carried her toward the ambulance waiting in the driveway. Shadow tried to follow, but his legs folded under him before he reached the garage threshold. Ethan caught him gently, lowering him against his own knees. "You did it, boy," he whispered. Sophie looked back from the ambulance, eyes heavy but clear. "Bring him," she said. And for the first time that night, Shadow let his head rest against Ethan's hand, as if he had finally been given permission to be tired. The ambulance carried Sophie through the rain with Shadow beside her, not on the stretcher, but close enough for his nose to touch the edge of her blanket whenever the road turned. Ethan rode in the front passenger seat because Sophie had asked for the dog, and Shadow had looked at Ethan as if the request required both of them. Officer Mitchell followed behind in her patrol SUV, while Mrs. June Parker stayed at the garage to call Megan Riley again and again until the mother finally answered. At Memorial Community Clinic, the doors opened into warm light, clean tile, and the soft rush of nurses who knew how to move quickly without frightening a child. Sophie was awake, wrapped in blankets, her pink backpack placed safely beside her. The first thing she did was turn her head toward Shadow. The German Shepherd stood on trembling legs near the exam room door, rainwater still dripping from his coat, the pink ribbon on his collar limp against his neck. A nurse brought water in a plastic bowl. Shadow looked at it, then back to Sophie. He did not drink. Dr. Paul Bennett arrived from the animal clinic across town with a gray medical bag and a towel warmed from the dryer. He knelt beside Shadow and checked him gently. "Cold, exhausted, sir paw pads," he said. "Some scrapes from the driveway and the storm, but nothing severe." Shadow barely reacted. His eyes stayed on the exam room until a nurse stepped out and said, "She is stable, tired, but she is going to be all right." Still, Shadow did not drink. Ethan crouched next to him. "You heard her," he whispered. "She is safe." Shadow's ears shifted, but his body stayed pointed toward the door. Then Sophie's small voice came from inside. "Shadow." The dog rose with more heart than strength. Ethan supported him with one hand under his chest and guided him into the room. Sophie lay beneath a white blanket, cheeks warmer now, hair damp against her forehead. Megan Riley sat beside the bed, one hand over her mouth, the other holding her daughter's fingers as if letting go might change the truth. She had arrived minutes earlier, breathless and shaking, carrying the terrible knowledge of every assumption that had gone wrong. Sophie reached toward the dog. Shadow placed his head on the edge of the bed, careful as a promise. "I am okay," she whispered. Those 3 words changed him. His eyes closed, his shoulders lowered. When Ethan set the water bowl near his paws, Shadow finally drank, slowly, with long tired pauses between each swallow. Megan looked at Ethan through tears. "I thought she was at art club. They thought I picked her up. I did not know the tow company had left the car inside your garage before anyone checked the back." Ethan shook his head. There was no bad intent. He looked down at Shadow. Only a dog who heard what everyone else missed. Sophie touched the pink ribbon on Shadow's collar. "I tied it there so he could always find me," she said. Ethan looked at the small ribbon, torn by rain and work, and understood that it had not been decoration. It had been a thread between a child and the one soul who refused to let distance become silence. Outside the clinic window, rain softened against the parking lot lights. Somewhere back in his garage, the gray sedan sat open now, harmless and quiet. But beside Sophie's bed, Shadow rested with one paw against the blanket, and Ethan knew the rescue was not finished when the door opened. It was finished only when the loyal heart finally believed everyone was safe. Memorial Community Clinic became quiet after midnight, the way places do when fear has passed through them and left everyone listening to the small sounds of survival. Sophie slept under warm blankets, one hand resting near Shadow's head, Her fingers curled lightly in his fur even after sleep took her. Megan sat beside the bed in a chair pulled too close, watching her daughter breathe with the stunned devotion of a mother who had nearly lost the right to watch anything ordinary again. Shadow lay on a folded blanket at the side of the bed, his paws cleaned and wrapped by Dr. Bennett, his coat dry now but still carrying the faint smell of rain and garage dust. Every few minutes, the German Shepherd lifted his head and counted the room. Sophie, Megan, Ethan near the door, window, hallway. Then he lowered his chin again, never quite trusting sleep with the people he loved. Ethan stood outside the room with a paper cup of coffee cooling in his hand. Officer Mitchell had finished her report. The tow company had been contacted. The school had confirmed the missed pickup confusion, and the sedan would stay open and inspected until every faulty wire and lock was understood. There was no villain hiding in the story. That almost made it harder. No bad heart to blame. No cruel hand. Just assumptions, rain, a broken electrical lock, and a child too small for silence to reach the right ears. Chaplain Robert Hayes arrived sometime after 1 in the morning, his coat dark with weather, his face soft with the kind of concern that did not demand explanation. He stood beside Ethan near the hallway vending machines. "Karen called me," he said. Ethan nodded. "I figured." The chaplain looked through the glass towards Sophie's room. "She is safe." "She is." "And the dog?" Ethan looked at Shadow, who had opened one eye again at the sound of Megan shifting in her chair. He waited for her to tell him. Chaplain Hayes followed his gaze. "Some souls do not believe rescue until the person they love says it out loud." Ethan stared at the coffee cup. "Years ago, after a snowstorm, I passed a car on a service road. Dispatch said it had been cleared. I kept moving." His voice lowered. "Later, I found out they were wrong." The chaplain did not fill the silence with easy mercy. He let it sit between them, honest and cold. "And tonight?" Ethan looked back toward Shadow's pink ribbon, still tied to the collar, faded and rain-worn but holding. "Tonight a dog would not let me trust an empty answer." Inside the room, Sophie stirred and whispered Shadow's name in her sleep. The German Shepherd raised his head at once, ears lifting, body ready despite exhaustion. Megan touched his shoulder. "She is okay," she whispered. Shadow looked at Sophie, then at Megan, then slowly placed his head back on the blanket. Ethan watched that small surrender and felt something inside him loosen. Not disappear. Some memories do not leave because one night ends differently. But they can change shape when grace enters through a garage door on 4 trembling paws. Dr. Bennett stepped out with an extra towel and smiled faintly. He should rest for several days. Warm food, short walks, no heroic missions. Ethan almost smiled. "You may have to convince him." The doctor looked through the glass. "No, Sophie will." On the bedside table, Megan had placed the torn pink ribbon from Shadow's collar after carefully untying it for the exam. Sophie had asked that it stay where she could see it. Ethan looked at that small strip of color and understood why it mattered. It had been a child's birthday ribbon, a dog's compass, and a bridge through rain, metal, and fear. By morning, it would still be there, not cleaned, not fixed, just faithful. And in the hallway, beside the quiet room where a girl slept safely and a German Shepherd finally rested, Ethan realized the door he had failed to open years ago no longer stood alone in his heart. By morning, the story had reached farther than Ethan's garage ever could. It moved through Colorado Springs in quiet circles, from Memorial Community Clinic to the school office, from the school office to the tow company, from the tow company to the small diner where veterans drank coffee before sunrise. People did not speak of it loudly. They lowered their voices around it, as if the rescue had been made of glass. Megan stayed beside Sophie until the clinic released her late that afternoon, and Shadow stayed wherever Sophie's hand could find him. Dr. Bennett allowed it because every time he tried to move the German Shepherd to a separate room, Sophie's eyes filled with fear and Shadow rose on bandaged paws as if pain were only a suggestion. "Fine," the doctor finally said, placing a fresh blanket beside the bed. "The patient has a patient." Sophie smiled for the first time since the garage. Ethan saw it from the doorway and looked away before the sight could undo him. Officer Mitchell came by with an update. The tow company had changed its after-hours checklist. No vehicle would be left in a private garage again without a full interior check, documented and witnessed. The school had called Megan with apologies and new pickup procedures. The sedan would be repaired only after every lock, latch, and seat mechanism had been tested. Megan listened with both hands wrapped around a paper cup she never drank from. I kept thinking somebody would blame me, she said. Officer Mitchell shook her head. Everybody made assumptions. Shadow did not. The dog lifted his head at his name, then settled again when Sophie touched his ear. Later, Ethan returned to his garage with Chaplain Hayes. The rain had stopped, but the floor still held dark tracks where Shadow had dragged himself from the side door to the sedan. The gray car sat open under the work light, harmless now, but Ethan could not look at it as just a machine. On the rear door, the small claw marks remained near the seam, shallow lines in dust and paint. Ethan ran one finger near them without touching. I was going to sand those out before I repaint the door, he said. Chaplain Hayes stood beside him. Are you still? Ethan shook his head after a long silence. No. They found a small spot on the workbench where Sophie's pink ribbon could rest until she came back for it. Ethan placed it on a clean white cloth, not straightened, not washed, not made pretty. The ribbon had survived rain, mud, fear, and a dog's impossible devotion. It deserved to look like the truth. Chaplain Hayes looked around the garage. The tools, the old lift, the coffee stains, the wall of veteran service patches, the open car door. This place will feel different now, he said. Ethan nodded. It should. Near sunset, Megan brought Sophie and Shadow back for a short visit. Sophie wore a warm red coat and held her mother's hand. Shadow walked slowly beside her, paws wrapped, head high despite exhaustion. When they entered the garage, he went straight to the sedan and stopped at the rear door. For one breath, everyone went still. Then Sophie bent and placed both arms gently around his neck. It is open now, she whispered. Shadow sniffed the door seam, touched the claw marks once with his nose, and stepped back. Ethan felt something inside him step back too, away from the old winter road, away from the car he had not checked, toward this garage where a wounded dog had refused to let silence win. Megan picked up the pink ribbon from the workbench and looked at Ethan. Sophie wants it framed here, she said. Sophie nodded. So people remember to check. Ethan looked at Shadow, then at the open sedan, then at the ribbon in the child's hand. Then that is where it stays, he said. Outside, the last rainwater dripped from the gutters, slow and soft, like the end of a prayer finally answered. A week later, Ethan's garage opened before dawn, not because another car needed fixing, but because one small promise did. The storm had passed, leaving Colorado Springs washed clean beneath a pale mountain sky. Rainwater no longer ran under the side door. The concrete floor had dried, but Ethan had left the faint track marks near the sedan untouched until he knew what to do with them. He swept around them, not over them. He worked around the claw marks on the rear door, not through them. Some marks were not damage. Some were witnesses. By 8 o'clock, Megan arrived with Sophie and Shadow. Sophie wore her red coat again, her pink backpack resting safely against her shoulder, and Shadow walked beside her with slower steps but brighter eyes. His paws were still wrapped lightly, and Dr. Bennett had ordered rest, short walks, and no garage patrols. Shadow agreed with none of it, but he obeyed Sophie when she touched his collar and said, "Easy." Ethan had cleared a place on the wall beside the workbench, between an old Marine Corps photo and a row of neatly labeled socket wrenches. On the bench lay a small wooden frame, the torn pink ribbon, and a white card Sophie had written in careful letters. She had erased twice and pressed too hard with the pencil, but the words stayed clear. He stayed by the car. Megan looked at the card and covered her mouth. Ethan pretended to adjust the frame so she could have a private second. Chaplain Hayes stood near the garage door with 2 coffees, saying nothing because some prayers did not need a voice. When Ethan placed the ribbon inside the frame, he did not clean away the rain stains. He did not straighten the torn edge. Sophie had asked him not to. That is how he found me, she said. Shadow watched from beside the sedan, ears lifted whenever the ribbon moved. When the frame was finished, Ethan hung it where the first light from the garage window could touch it every morning. Megan read the words aloud once. Her voice nearly broke on stage. Shadow stepped forward and placed his nose gently against Sophie's hand, as if reminding everyone that staying had never been the hard part. Leaving before she was safe would have been impossible. Afterward, Ethan showed them the changes he had made. A brighter motion light above the side door. A new interior checklist clipped beside the garage entrance. A small sign near the workbench that read, Check the quiet places first. Officer Mitchell had sent over a safety card for vehicles with electrical lock issues, and Ethan had pinned it beside the frame. Sophie walked to the gray sedan and stood by the open rear door. Her face grew quiet, but she did not step back. Shadow stood between her and the car, then looked up at her. "It is okay," she whispered. "It is open now." Ethan watched the dog lower his head and sniff the threshold once, then turn away from the door and lied down beside Sophie's shoes. The garage exhaled. So did Ethan. The old winter car in his memory did not disappear, but it no longer owned every shadow behind a closed door. Beside that memory now stood a girl's careful handwriting, a pink ribbon inside a frame, and a German shepherd who had dragged Mercy across a rain-soaked floor until a man finally listened. 1 month later, the gray sedan rolled out of Ethan's garage under a clean Colorado morning, its electrical system repaired, its locks tested, its rear seat checked twice before the engine ever turned over. Megan sat behind the wheel with both hands steady. Sophie sat in the back seat with her pink backpack beside her, buckled safely, cheeks bright in the sunlight. Shadow sat next to her on a protective seat cover, black and tan coat shining, paws heeled, pink ribbon replaced by a soft new collar tag shaped like a small heart. He did not press against the door anymore. He did not whine at the handle. He simply rested his head near Sophie's knee and watched Ethan through the open window with calm amber eyes. Ethan stood in the driveway wearing his old work jacket, one hand on the open garage door frame, the other holding a paper cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink. Behind him, on the wall beside the workbench, the framed ribbon caught the morning light. Beneath it, Sophie's careful words waited for every customer who would ever bring him a car. He stayed by the car. Officer Mitchell had stopped by before her shift to see the sedan leave, and Chaplain Hayes stood near the mailbox, quiet as always, smiling with his eyes. Megan lowered the driver's window. "Thank you," she said. Ethan looked at Shadow first. He did the hard part. Sophie leaned forward from the back seat. "You listened." That was harder for him to answer. He looked past the sedan to the mountains, their peaks white beneath the blue sky, and thought of the winter road years ago, the vehicle everyone said had been checked, the silence he had believed because believing was easier than stopping. That memory still hurt. It probably always would, but it no longer stood alone. Beside it now was rain on a garage roof, one weak tap from behind a seat, a pink ribbon dark with water, and a wounded German shepherd who had refused to leave the one place people needed to look again. Ethan stepped closer to the car and rested his hand gently on the roof. "Check the quiet places first," he said. Sophie smiled. "That is your new rule. Best one I have." Megan started the engine. The sedan moved slowly down the driveway, then turned toward the sunlit street. Shadow watched Ethan until the car reached the corner, then lowered his head into Sophie's lap. Ethan stayed there after they were gone, listening to the quiet garage behind him. It did not feel empty. It felt awake. The claw marks near the rear door had been sealed, not erased. The checklist hung by the entrance. The framed ribbon glowed beside the tools. Some miracles do not arrive loudly. They crawl through rain, scratch once at the door, and wait beside what everyone else thinks is just a car, until one human heart learns to open the silence.